In this video, I'm going to be analysing the poem Flag by John Agard, and this will be used for revision for your GCSE literature exam on poetry. Now in this video, as it's the first, I'm going to go back to basics with the poetry analysis, and this is something that I use to help you remember all the points you need to be thinking about for all poems, and I use this at GCSE, at A-level, and for any poem. You may be familiar with this. You might have learnt something differently from your teachers, but this is what I use, and it's the flirts. The F there stands for form. This is talking about the type of poem that it might be, whether it's a ballad, whether it's a sonnet, and also I like to think of form as in the structure of the poem, so how the poem is laid out on the page, how it's organised into stanzas, and so forth. The L is for language. Now, this isn't to refer to whether it's written in English or not, but it's the type of words that they're using, the vocabulary they're using. Are there any repeated words? Are there any particular words that are being used to create a specific effect? I stands for imagery. What kind of images are being created? Now, images aren't just images that we can imagine seeing, but they're ones that we can imagine hearing or smelling or touching or tasting. So anyway, any kind of sensory images that are brought about through the language, through the structure of the poem. The R is rhythm and rhyme. Is there a set rhythm to the poem? Is there a uniform rhythm throughout the poem? Is there a rhyme scheme? If not, why? What does that say about the poem? Are there any particular words that are rhyming, and are they significant? The T, that's for tone. Tone is talking about the atmosphere, the mood that the poem is created. How does the reader feel after reading the poem? What does the poet want the reader to feel after reading the poem? And the S is for subject. Now, you might have known that to be structure, but as I said, I think of structure coming under form, so I like to think of the S standing for subject. And in a little way, back to front, the S is what you would always start with. You need to work out what the poem means, what it's about, what it is. Is it telling us a story? Is it capturing a mood? Is it capturing a particular image? So, with Flag, we need to start with the poem. So here's Flag by John Agard. What's that fluttering in a breeze? It's just a piece of cloth that brings a nation to its knees. What's that unfurling from a pole? It's just a piece of cloth that makes the guts of men grow bold. What's that rising over a tent? It's just a piece of cloth that dares the coward to relent. What's that flying across a field? It's just a piece of cloth that will outlive the blood you bleed. How can I possess such a cloth? Just ask for a flag, my friend, then blind your conscience to the end. So, as I said, we need to start with the subject. We need to think about what this poem is about. What is the message that John Agard is trying to put across? And this is what I think it's about. And I think that it's handy to try and put the poem, or the subject of the poem, should I say, into one sentence. This is what I think it is. The poem explores the oppressive and destructive power of patriotism. Now, patriotism, as you probably know, is a love of one's country, and oppressive means something that has authority over something, but in a cruel and punishing way. So it's looking at how the love of the country can actually be oppressive on the person, so it can actually have authority over a person, and not in a good way. Now that we've worked out the subject of the poem, we can look at what John Agard is doing in terms of form and in terms of the structure. Now, I've got two stanzas here on the left-hand side of the screen, and this should give you an idea about what kind of structure he's using. You'll notice both stanzas look very similar, and that's continued throughout. So as you can see, there is a very strict structure to the poem. The structure is uniform throughout. Every stanza is made up of 3 lines, and they all start and end in the same way. They have the question at the start, then they have that repeated line, it's just a piece of cloth, and then it has, as a last line, a kind of reflection on the power of the piece of cloth. Okay, so it has a question and an answer, and you'll probably notice that there are two voices in the poem. So it's meant to be two people speaking. The person that's asking the question, and then the person who's answering it. So now that we've identified these 4 points about form in the poem, we need to start analysing and evaluating, because if we're going to get the good marks, then that's what we need to do. It's no good just saying that it's got a uniform 3-line stanzas throughout the poem. We need to think, why has John Agard done this? What is the effect of that on the reader? And again, this is what I think is the effect. So first of all, this strict structure throughout the poem, I think, reflects or represents how patriotism is restrictive. Okay, the strict structure is it confines the poem, and that represents the restriction of patriotism on ourselves, and on our own independence. The use of the question and answer reflect or show how the poem is reflective, and this has got something to do with the when we come on to the tone later on in the video. The repeated questions and answers is because John Agard, the poet, wants us, the reader, to question our own attitude towards patriotism, towards our love of our country. Are we patriotic, and why? Is that the right thing to do? Do we mindlessly love our country and not really think for ourselves in that sense? Moving on to the L then of flirts, the language, and I've picked out 4 words to use as evidence. And these words come from the first 4 stanzas, and they're in the first line of each stanza: fluttering, unfurling, rising, and flying. And you'll notice that I've picked out verbs. These are all verbs that John Agard uses. And of course, verbs are actions, so they're showing movement, the movement of the flag. At first it is fluttering, then it's unfurling, then it's rising, then it's flying. You will notice that as we go through the poem, the movement of the flag is growing more powerful. If you compare fluttering to flying, there's a different connotation to flying that suggests kind of more power, more dominance, and there's this steady progression as the poem goes from the first stanza right through to the end. So again, I've identified, but what does this mean? The movement of the flag throughout the poem reflects its growing significance. It is growing in power as the poem progresses. It's growing in power, and it's also growing in dominance, not just in itself, but over the people, over the nations. This shows that patriotism without thought can be oppressive and can dominate. And remember that the flag throughout the poem represents patriotism. The flag stands for the country, stands for love of country, and when the flag is growing in dominance and growing in power, so is patriotism, and therefore so does the oppressive effect. Okay, moving on to imagery. You will have probably noticed that this is the key image of the poem. It stands out because it is repeated in every single stanza. It's the answer to all of the questions. It's just a piece of cloth. It's just a piece of cloth. John Agard keeps on repeating this, and really this image is important because a cloth is insignificant, certainly if it's just a piece of cloth, and that's what a flag is. It's a piece of cloth with a pattern, with a symbol on it, with a symbol of a nation, of a country, and so forth. But John Agard continually says it's just a piece of cloth, which kind of contradicts the power that it has over us, over the nations. This cloth image is juxtaposed. Now, juxtapose means putting two things, two images or two words or something next to each other, either to contradict or to complement. In this case, the image is contradicting Okay, or contrasting. It's juxtaposed next to the effects of patriotism. On the line beneath it's just a piece of cloth shows the effects of patriotism. And as I said, this juxtaposition shows a contrast between the cloth and the power that it holds. So, having identified, let's analyse. The repeated image of the cloth emphasises the insignificance of a literal flag, so a real flag, because it is just, as I said, a piece of cloth with a painted image on it. But because of that, it kind of, John Agard is kind of pointing out that patriotism in itself is insignificant, and it has too much power. As I said, this juxtaposition, okay, this is the noun. In the last slide, I used the verb of juxtapose. The juxtaposition shows this contrast and shows quite a stark contrast between a love of one's country and the effect that it has on nations and the individual. Okay, there's obviously, that's not the only image within the poem. There's others, and these quotes here are the last line of the first 4 stanzas. That brings a nation to its knees, that makes the guts of men grow bold, that dares the coward to relent, that will outlive the blood you bleed. Very, very powerful images in each stanza. And as we have said, each image here ends the stanza, and the image is the effects of patriotism, either on a nation or on an individual. Each image, significantly, is oppressive. It shows that authoritative power, and not a good example of authority. Okay, it's an example of authority that reduces the people or the things beneath it. And each stanza ends with this image, in order to kind of force the reader to reflect, to think about patriotism, think about their own thoughts of patriotism. Okay. These are a few thoughts that I want you to think about when thinking about these images. So, which nation is brought to its knees? Is it the nation, so for example, is it Britain? Britain was an empire for most of the 19th century and went through, well, for all of the 19th century, but it had the largest empire in the world, and it colonized countries such as India and so forth with this power of the flag, and turned India and Australia, etc., under the nation of England, under the nation of Britain. So is that the nation that's brought to its knees? The colonized country? Was it India? Was it Cyprus, Canada, etc.? Or is it Britain itself? Are the people of Britain brought to their knees by their blind patriotism? Makes the guts grow bold. Patriotism can develop courage in someone. But if you think about that word guts in a literal sense, you think about guts on the inside, and of course in war and death and maiming and wounds, and that the image of guts coming out. Okay, so the guts in the figurative sense is in showing courage, but if you literally show your guts, you're not really in a good state of health, are you? Dares the coward to relent. Is the coward surrendering to the flag? And then, or if they surrendered to the flag, is that when they are making them relent? Or there's a typo on that, it's meant to say, or is it that they just stop being a coward and that they become brave because of the flag? I'll have to correct that typo. Never mind. And then the last image, that will outlive the blood you bleed. John Agard is telling us that the flag is permanent, but our lives are not. And therefore the reflective point in there is it worth fighting and dying for? The flag will always be around, but if we fight for it, we might not be. Now, rhythm and rhyme. Well, there's quite a uniform rhyme scheme throughout the poem, throughout most of the poem until we get to the last stanza. And then and the rhythm is constant throughout. And so some of the rhyming words here we have breeze, knees, pole, bold, tent, and relent. Okay, so the rhyme scheme helps to make a connection between the first and the third line of each stanza. This makes a connection between the question and the answer. The rhyme connects the flag with its effects, so the effects, the oppressive effects, as we said, of patriotism. The poem has lots of enjambment in. Now, enjambment means no punctuation at the end of a line, and you will notice in the first 4 stanzas there is enjambment in the second and third line. So the second and third line of each stanza moves fluidly into the next. And the uniform rhythm links with the strict structural pattern. Okay, so what we were talking about in form earlier on. So the uniform rhythm helps to kind of define that strict structure that we were talking about earlier. Okay, the rhyme scheme enables Agard to make the connections between the flag and therefore patriotism and its oppressive effects. The enjambment makes the second line flow into the third, and therefore the oppressive image in that last line is contrasted directly with that just a piece of cloth. So we have the insignificant image placed directly next to and flowing directly into a very powerful and oppressive and dominant image. Now, tone, you probably notice that I've left the last stanza, and that's not to say that it's not worth analysing. It is, but I just wanted to save it for tone because I think the last stanza really helps to sum up the mood and the atmosphere of the poem. How can I possess such a cloth? Just ask for a flag, my friend, then blind your conscience to the end. You'll notice it's slightly different. It still has the question and the answer, but the rhyme scheme is different. Rather than the first and the third line of the stanza rhyming, the second and the third line rhyme. You'll also see that there's no enjambment in this. There's a full stop at the end of the second line. Now, this last stanza is an envoy, and now an envoy is a final stanza of a poem that either addresses the reader or reflects on the poem that has preceded it. And this is the case in this poem. The final stanza reflects on the 4 stanzas that have preceded it. In this stanza, the questioner asks how they can own the flag, and this kind of shows that they've pretty much misunderstood the poem as a whole. And this kind of shows that in this last line, then blind your conscience to the end. Conscience is your sense of right and wrong, and if you are patriotic, or if you are patriotic without thinking for yourself, this can distort your sense of what is right and what is wrong. And therefore I think that the tone of the poem is sombre. It's quite sad. It's quite it's full of disappointment that patriotism is so powerful and so oppressive, and so the tone of the poem is sad. So the poem is sombre and reflective in tone. The envoy suggests that people have not learned from history and the effects of patriotism. So despite having all those powerful images in the first 4 stanzas, the questioner still hasn't understood it. It wants to possess the cloth. And interestingly, if you see, how can I possess such cloth? I think the language choice there, possess, is really important and really significant. The person is asking how they can own the cloth, so own the flag, but the flag can also possess them and own them. And finally, the last point I would like to make is that John Agard is kind of showing that a love for one's country, so patriotism, mindless patriotism, blind patriotism, distorts our sense of right and wrong. And by ending the poem with this line, I think that this conveys the sad tone of the poem as a whole.